Okay. Good afternoon. I'm here with my guest, George MacDonald. I'm so glad you could be here today, George.
Great, thanks, Doug. Glad to be here as well. Thanks for having me.
George and I work together, also at McLean Hospital, but he has a very accomplished career. He's a playwright, he's a comedian and actor. Some of the stage plays that he has written include Waiting for Whitey, which we did a little report in the Somerville Times about.
Right, yeah.
And that one has got a lot of acclaim. And At the Funny Factory, In a Better Place, Whistling Past the Graveyard. What else we have? And he has screenplays include both Guns Blazing, Still in the Picture, and Spider Sequence. Some of Mr. MacDonald's film credits are Monument Avenue, Celtic Pride, Bluff, and When Stand Up Stood Up. Stood out, rather. His television credits include Mad TV, The Michael Richards Show, A&E's Comedy on the Road, and he made a directorial debut with Why Work, a sketch comedy show that appeared in the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. Mr. MacDonald is a member of SAF-AFTRA, Actors Equity Association, and the Dramatists Guild of America. So quite a list there, George.
Some of that's actually true.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
Right, we all inflate it. No, it is all true.
No, actually, it is all true.
Sure, yeah. So I was going to ask you, I read an interview with Mark Maron who talked about he's a comedian, and he talked about the big comedy revolution that was in the 80s that you were an integral part of. You were there with Steve Sweeney, Don Gavin, Mike MacDonald, and you were and you're George MacDonald.
Yeah, Warren MacDonald, my brother, Bob Lazarus, Chance Langton.
All those guys.
Yeah.
All those guys. And can you tell us a bit about the comedy milieu then and how it differs now, if you're familiar?
Yeah. Well, I think back then one of the luxuries that we had was we didn't know what we were doing, kind of, so we just did what we did. It turned into like two camps pretty early on. Initially, it was the Comedy Connection was the one club in town. That was it, and
where was that in town?
That was at on Warrington Street. It's actually on the right on the ground floor where Blue Man Group is now in the Charles Playhouse.
Oh,
and in the
wasn't Nick's around there? I remember
district. Nick's was also on the same street. But
yeah,
that came a few years later. I think that was maybe because. Let's see, Comedy Connection, I think 1978, I think they opened. I think it was around that time. And Nick's opened in the early, maybe 82, 83, something like that. So, but when Barry Crimmins, who's actually got a movie out now called Call Me Lucky, that does great film, was just in the Boston Independent Film Festival. And it talks a little bit about his personal story, but he was a huge part of making the comedy scene in Boston the way that it was, because he opened up the club called the Ding Ho Comedy Club in Cambridge in Inman Square, and that became, for me and a lot of other guys, that became like the clubhouse. And once you got a clubhouse, you're all set. Some great things can happen. Yeah.
Okay, and so what was the center of it? Ding Ho, you think, was the center of that?
Well, it was kind of there were comics that worked both rooms. There were comics that only worked either of those rooms. There was just a lot going on at that time, and I think the novelty of stand-up comedy, it was pretty fresh, you know? I mean, it was definitely an offshoot of...
Why was it fresh? Because there was stand-up comedy before that.
Yeah, but not around here.
Really?
Not in New England, I don't think it was. I mean, Catch a Rising Star was around, but I think what happened as I've
read... there was no Borscht Belt kind of thing going on?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there might have been back in the Scully Square, back in those days. I would imagine there was a whole circuit to work, but there was nothing like that in the 70s here. And the original Saturday Night Live, Not Ready for Primetime Players, that was so popular, there was a boom right after that in local comedy clubs around the country. So people get into what those guys were doing. And, I think that was a big part of it too.
And how do you think timing? How do you think the milieu now and the comedy scene differs from when you were breaking?
I'm not really doing it, so it'd be hard for me to say. I don't know. I mean, still a lot of my friends are still doing it. I mean, the job itself, I'm sure, hasn't changed a whole lot. I mean, to get up in front of a room full of strangers and trying to make them laugh is still not the easiest job in the world. But so I'm sure that hasn't changed. But the venues themselves, I'm not working them now, so I don't know. Once in a while I'll do a stand-up show. I'll do like a benefit show, like for Right Turn, a place that I do a lot of work with. It's a creative place for people in recovery, and they do a lot of fundraiser shows, and I work with them to do a comedy show. But pretty much, I'm not really in the regular rank and file of guys that are doing stand-up now. So I'd be the last guy in the world to be able to tell you what it's like now.
Okay, now if you had to define the Boston personality of comedy, what would that be? I mean, is it New York?
Yeah,
is it New York kind
of?
Well,
East Coast, I think it's definitely. I would definitely.
Boston has always had something very specific about it. Can you sort of capture that tincture?
Well, two things. I think it's probably just as abrasive as any New York comic sort of cliche could or stereotype could be, but I think too it's rapid fire. I mean, the way that it was in the clubs when I was working, which would have been 1979 to 1999, I was in there every night, pretty much 6-7 nights a week at least, and it was pretty much machine gun style. Boom, 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 one joke right after, and then the audiences sort of got used to like not waiting. You know, I can remember doing a show. I'll give you an example. I was doing a show down in Florida, and Al April was a comic, and he was talking about Boston comics, and Al talked like in slow motion, and he said, "You Boston comics don't know about the pause."
Yeah, right.
And he was right, because it was da-da-da-da-da, you know, just slam them, hit them hard.
Right.
As hard as you can.
Now, we both work at McLean Hospital, which is a psychiatric hospital, and so I'm going to ask you a psychological question. What do you think the psychological, and if you can, we actually say there's a typical comedian, but, you know, there's personalities, you know, in different professions. And what is the psychological profile of a typical comedian? I mean, we have people say, oh, he's a sad man, you know, actually behind all the...
Yeah.
And actually, you were telling me something a bit different, though.
Yeah. Well, I think it's definitely, it has to be somebody who either overtly wants attention, like a real type A personality where it's got to be about them, or somebody who doesn't have that nerve to have the attention unless they're doing stand-up. I think those two types are pretty prevalent. But I know I've heard Robert McKee, who wrote the book Story, and I took his writing seminar when I lived out in Los Angeles, and he said he had one whole day that he just taught about the comedy genre, and he specifically talking about films. But he said he called it the angry art, and he said underneath all of it, there's a lot of anger, and there's probably some truth to that. Not that.
Are you angry?
Not right now.
No, hopefully not. But were you an angry man?
Oh, I think I'm definitely potentially capable of being angry.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is, do you sense a lot of anger in comedians and things like that? A lot of like we were saying, Freud says that comedy is a form of anger. You know.
Well, I think too, it's like, I mean, even the terminology. How'd your show go? I killed them. You know, I mean,
yeah, right.
There's always a lot of sort of angry. Certainly, killing people would be an angry act, I should think.
Right.
I mean, that would be. There's a lot of stuff subtextually there. I think that is not necessarily all laughs and giggles.
Right. Okay. Now, you make no bones about your struggle with alcohol. You've been sober for many years, and this struggle sort of, they say, like among writers like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, initially when they were drinking, it released their inhibitions. They were able to write. But then by the time they hit their late 30s, they had nothing else to say. I mean, because they burnt out with all the booze.
Right.
I mean, was this a similar trajectory with you think?
Well, for me, it worked until it didn't work anymore. It was definitely one of those situations where, I certainly drank and did drugs before I ever set foot on a comedy stage or inside a comedy club, for that matter. But what happened?
Your father was a bartender, wasn't
he? He was, He was. And a teamster and a Shylock and a burglar. He was a Renaissance man. He was good at a lot of things, actually. And we would. What was the question again?
The similar trajectory is like you start out drinking and
it
releases out and releases your inhibitions and maybe makes you creative. I mean, let's face it. Sometimes.
Well, I think sometimes that's true. There were nights definitely where I went up on stage and as coming off the stage, people would say, "Man, I didn't hear any of those jokes before," and I'd think, "Neither did I. I don't know where that came from." You know.
Yeah.
So sometimes it worked. The thing about that is, as a technique, and I think you divide any sort of performing into two. There's two sides to it. There's talent, which is your God-given stuff, and then there's technique, is how do you apply that talent. And if your technique is to get shattered before you go up on stage, eventually that's going to backfire on you. I mean, for sure, it's like that. There's no shelf life to that.
I'm sorry. Repeat that again.
If your technique is to get drunk before you, in order to be loose enough to work or to be creative, eventually that will backfire.
Well, that we can see in Lenny Bruce, who was using heroin extensively,
Right.
and then he just suddenly, I think he went downhill when all it did was his rants about how they were trying to prosecute him for obscenity and all that, and then
Right.
he's just sort of lost it.
Right. Well, I think too. Yeah, I mean, it's just like ultimately addiction, whatever your drug of choice is, alcohol or heroin or whatever, it becomes all about. In the beginning, it will work, and then it becomes all about the addiction. It's sort of like this side dish that you have, and then all of a sudden it becomes the entree, and then it's all about that. You know, there's nothing.
Yeah, that's all you care.
Yeah, right. And I think, and it's very, you know, it creeps up on people so slowly that a lot of times you don't notice it, you know. And I can honestly say the last 2 years of my drinking and drug, because originally I did nothing before I would do a show. Nothing, zero. I would just go up and say completely stone cold sober because I wanted to be at the top of my game. And I also wanted to get the rush that I got from performing at full intensity. And after a while, you go, well, okay, I kind of have this figured out now. A couple of drinks can't hurt, and then a couple of drinks becomes, you know, you're blacking out on stage, which is where I was at the end, you know. So, but eventually, you know, in my case, the last couple of years, it wasn't even fun anymore. There was no fun in it. It was just like sort of this repetitive behavior of addiction that was just like, I'm not even enjoying this. Why am I doing this? And then, you know, so when I did put all that stuff down and start working on getting sober and doing stand-up, you almost had to relearn how to do it, actually, really, because it had been, you know, having been sedated, now you're not sedated, you're a live wire and everything. You know.
Yeah, so you had to relearn things.
So it took a while to like readjust, but it certainly, and actually, being sober on stage, you're 100% better as any kind of performer. You have to be, because, you know, you're at the time, you have that clarity. I mean, you don't have that when you're drinking, so, or you smoked up or whatever, you know, whatever your drug is.
I mean, they had a lot of, you know, comics who were, you know, played the drunken guy, but they weren't drunk. I forget this one guy, he always played the drunken slob.
Oh, Foster Brooks?
Foster Brooks, but he wasn't drunk when he was up there.
No, not
sure
at all.
as hell.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, being actually drunk would destroy your timing.
Yeah.
You'd be doing your own show on your own wavelength, and I mean, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, you might get away with that a little bit.
But after a while, if you're real drunk, it doesn't really affect you in
Right.
the same way. Yeah.
Yeah, as a way of doing your job, I mean, it would ultimately get in the way. There's no question, in my mind, certainly.
Now, you're a native son of Southie.
Yeah.
Before it became gentrified and all
Yeah.
that. And,
Well, I actually grew up. Actually, my parents were from the South End, and I was born in the South End on Emerald Street, which is.
Yeah, I was talking about the gentrification of the South End, and you were saying to me, "Oh boy, I see these places, all these fancy places, and I used to piss on them when I was a kid."
Oh well, not me, but I mean, you'd just see, like, you know, winos all over the streets, and now they're like a sidewalk cafe.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
I mean, yeah, those places were like bad news. I mean, that was a very sketchy neighborhood back in. I was born in '54, so back in like even 1960.
Yeah.
That neighborhood was in total disrepair, and we moved over to South Boston. I guess I was probably like 4 or 5 years old.
Okay.
However old you are when you're in kindergarten, and that's and I lived there until I was almost 30 years old.
Okay. So, I was going to say,
And there are still some people that would say, "Well, you're not really from Southie."
right? Why would they say that?
Well, because I mean, if you're not born there, it's like, that's it.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
it.
right.
That is the deal breaker.
Yeah. So,
Some people.
some people would say that, yeah. But I was going to say, so you did, and when you were at UMass Boston, you did have an experience with Whitey Bulger.
Yeah.
And that inspired you to actually write a play, Waiting for Whitey, that was favorably reviewed in the Boston Herald and other, you know,
Yeah.
outlets like that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, what happened was I was going to UMass Boston. The campus had just opened. The Harbor campus was in
Right.
1977, and I used to hitchhike. I don't think the bus line was even set up at that point, and I would hitchhike, and because it was the 70s, I would still smoking joints and stuff, and I'm hitchhiking, and a car pulled over, and I thought it was somebody that I knew, and I jumped in the car, and I said, "Hi, how's it going?" You know, talking to him, and then I realized I could tell from his reaction that it wasn't who I thought it was. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I knew you from school." And he said, "Well, you probably do recognize me, but it's not from school." And he said, "My name's Jimmy Bulger." And he made it very clear who he was. And I was like, "Oh, no, where are you going?" So he gave me a ride, right to actually the most roundabout destination, route you could imagine to my destination. But I was in the car for maybe 10 minutes or so, and it wasn't what I was expecting. And like I say, I just smoked a joint at school with my buddies. And yeah.
Was your father familiar with him? Because you say he was a sort of Renaissance man.
Yeah, well, actually, there were people that I knew in the neighborhood that didn't know who Bulger was at that time. I can remember telling people that story. I only knew him because we used to go into Triple O's for last call when we'd be coming home from nightclubbing in Kenmore Square, which was where everybody went at that time. And we'd hit Triple O's.
Remember Narcissus?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Katie's.
Yeah.
And the Rat, I think, was still there.
Rat Skeller, yeah.
I'm not sure what
anyway,
else was
but what were we going to say?
But there were people that I told that story to at the time, and he had such a low profile at that time. That's the only reason I was aware of who he was. Somebody had pointed him out in Triple O's one night, who he was. I didn't know who he was either.
So this gave you the impetus to write a play some years later?
Well, the play actually that I wrote, so I think growing up in Southie gave me the overall inspiration for that particular play. The real inspiration for the character that I call Whitey in the play is from a movie directed by John Huston called The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean. There's a character in it.
That was with Paul Newman, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Stacy Keach plays a character, Bad Bob, and he's only in the movie for, I think, less than 3 minutes. And he steals the movie. It's just this great character, and I was so bummed out that he's only in the movie for like 3 minutes. And I kind of started thinking, what would he do if he lived in this era, if he were reincarnated? Oh, he'd probably be a criminal. He'd probably be, and the Bad Bob is an albino gunfighter in that movie. So what would that guy be like if he was reincarnated? Well, he'd probably be a criminal. And at the time, Bulger had just gone on the lam and was all over the headlines. And I said, I bet it'd be like that, So I sort of came up with this idea for this story. So I created this story that's sort of inspired by those events. It's not I was never interested in writing the Whitey Bulger story, because how do you get the true story? I mean, it's like, who do you believe? So I created my own sort of mythology, but set it in a bar in Boston. And when you see the play, it's pretty obvious. If you know anything about what South Boston was like back in the 70s and 80s, it's like, yeah, that's where it's supposed to be.
So you're doing some sort of revival of it, or?
Actually, I have the other play at the Funny Factory. We're putting together a reading to do, a stage reading, and I don't have a definite date yet, so I can't really plug it. But I'm putting the cast together, and so far I've got commitments. There's a cast of 7 men and 2 women, and I'm getting the dream cast, because
This isn't about Whitey, though.
No, that's not that. No, that's actually about stand-up. That's set in a stand-up. That play is actually inspired by the night that Peter LaSalle, the talent coordinator from The Tonight Show, came into the Ding Ho and saw Stephen Wright perform. They did a showcase. I was actually doing a gig on the road that particular night. But there was a showcase for Peter LaSalle, and he saw Stephen Wright, and he put Stephen Wright on The Tonight Show like maybe a week later, I guess.
Yeah.
And that really changed Boston comedy completely, because up until that point, I don't know if anybody really thought it could be a career, and a big career, until that happened. Then to see somebody go from Inman Square to The Tonight Show a week later or a couple of weeks later, that was a huge deal.
Are you still in touch with Wright?
I saw him at the festival, the Independent Boston Film Festival, when they showed Call Me Lucky. He stays very much in touch with Barry, and Barry was there, and Bobcat Goldthwait, who directed it, he was there. And those guys were Ding Ho comics. Barry was like the guy who ran the Ding Ho.
Yeah. And were you a Ding Hong Comet?
Yeah, so I was one of them.
Yeah, you were a Ding
Comics at
Hong
that
Comet. And acting, you've been an actor in movies and things like that. Can you tell us a little about that?
Oh, sure, yeah. I was in the film Monument Ave, which is a Dennis Leary film that they shot here. That was
it was a good film.
Yeah, that's actually it's funny while we were shooting it and watching it, you just it's kind of like patting your head and rubbing your stomach. You really can't. I can't do them at the same time anyway. But after a couple of years went by and I watched that film, I actually enjoyed that film a lot more. And it's a good film. It's a good
What did you
crime
play
film.
in it?
I played a bartender. Go
Okay.
figure.
Okay.
Gallivan. I'm in the last couple of scenes, and then there's a scene where we have a street hockey game, and I'm one of the, which took some real acting because I am not a hockey player at all. Even my friends were like giving me a hard time about that. And that film went to the Sundance Film Festival. That had to be 1996, I think. Mm-hmm. I think that actually happened right after when I put up my production of Waiting for Whitey, the play at the Lansdowne Street Playhouse. Right, that movie happened right after that. So that would have been about 1996, I think.
We were discussing at one point, you were saying about there's a bit of ageism in Hollywood. There's a certain cycle that one actor goes to another. Maybe you could just elaborate on that.
Well, I think just for pure castability. I mean, when you read a script, or you even see it when there's a casting notice, it's like most of the parts are written for people that, there's certainly not a whole lot of parts written for people 60 years old and up. So, and that just how it works. It's it's a young man's game or a young woman's game for sure. Well, the other thing too is like the people that start young, you have more you have a longer sort of lifespan of your career to learn how to do your career, your craft, and you have it. The more time you have, the more chances you'll get. So, and there is a certain.
And you were out in L.A. for a long time, right?
I lived out there for about 6 years, and I had gone back and forth out there a bunch of times before I moved there, and I finally just said I should just move here.
Yeah.
And I actually put up the play. Actually, I put Waiting for Whitey up out there, and by then I had adapted it into a screenplay, and the screenplay got optioned, and then that option ran out. Then somebody else optioned it, and then that option ran out, and right now it's it's reverted back to me. So. We'll see what happens.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah,
right.
Really.
And when could we see your new play, a reading of it?
It's like I say, I don't have a definite date yet, so I can't really plug it. But it's probably going to be sometime in November. We'll do. Getting back to that, dream cast that I have, because that's actually about that night, sort of, and it's not nobody. They're all composites of myself and people that I really knew the characters, but. The cast that we're going to have at the reading, I think out of a cast of 9 so far, the commitments I have, I think 6 of them all have done 5 of the 6 were full-time comics. So this is going to be really fun.
It's going to be an air of authenticity.
Oh yeah, it'll be fun. And one of them is an actor, and the other one is an actor comic. So we've got and I haven't got the whole cast. A commitment from all the people that I want yet, because it's August and a lot of people are on vacation. But once we get that, and then I'll make flyers and go the Facebook route, and
do the whole thing.
Yeah.
And here we have the backdrop of Union Square here, and this was your stomping grounds, and you lived here for a while.
I did, yeah.
Tell us about that.
I lived up on I think it was Oxford Street.
Okay.
It's right up the road here a bit, right off of Highland Ave. And
used to go to the Red House?
Did go to the Red House, yeah. That was my evening dinner when I'm coming back from doing stand-up gigs. This had to be back in it was in the 1980s.
Okay.
Definitely. I think I lived here till about maybe late 80s, actually.
Yeah.
87?
Have you noticed a lot of changes since then?
I'm really not around this part of the city that much anymore. Obviously there's more traffic. I think I noticed during the big dig, that's when I was living out in L.A. And when I came back here, the traffic was worse here than it was out in L.A. And everybody, the cliche is how bad L.A. traffic is, but it was actually worse here. And one thing I have noticed is there are just a lot more people, a lot more cars, a lot less places to park. That's definitely.
Well, maybe you could read us a short excerpt from What, something that you...
I can read, let me see.
Because we get about
Sure.
4 minutes.
Sure, let me see if I can read the, actually have, this is a, you know what, I'll read this right here. This is a short story, I was going to give you this anyway, Doug. This is a short story called Just Put That Anywhere, which is about stand-up.
Hopefully I have enough time for it, but for the sake of the tape, we'll let it run.
I'll just read a couple.
Okay.
Just Put That Anywhere. Hap Collins sat in the dressing room of the Chuckle Factory, chain-smoking cigarettes as he studied his set list and wondered how it had all come to this. Hap. That damn nickname. That was the biggest joke of all. There was nothing happy about Harry Collins. He couldn't remember the last time he enjoyed making anyone laugh, let alone the patrons of a nightclub audience. Audience, not the word he would use. For him, the audience was a faceless beast that inhaled his comic soul into its yawning maw, chewed it to bits, and then spat it out like toxic bile. Stand-up comedy was now a painful task rather than the enjoyable vocation it had once been. The Chuckle Factory was not as bad as some of the one-nighters on the circuit. The place had a stage with wings and a dressing room. The waitresses were competent and could serve a drink with no offstage noise if they put their minds to it. But truth be told, the Chuckle Factory was just another whistle stop on the fast track to nowhere. The stench of desperation that hung in the room was so thick you could slice it like cold cuts. Even the black curtains backstage made the place seem like a funeral parlor with a 2-drink minimum. Working in a club with an actual stage was a big plus. God knows Harry had tread the boards in bistros better suited for a slave auction than a legitimate venue of entertainment. Most of these dead-end gigs were a step above a medicine show on a carnival midway. But as long as the check cleared, Hap figured, what the hell? It was stand-up comedy he was doing, not Shakespeare. The lights were up and the microphone feedback was minimal. The ratty little stage gave the joint a hint of theatricality that made the Chuckle Factory a passable gig. They poured a good drink in this dive, and they didn't water down the booze much. Not that these slack-jawed morons called clientele would know the difference between a cheap bottle of beer and a good stiff drink. Not these lowlifes. Hap watched them stagger in for the show, searching for their seats and acclimating themselves to the showroom. Harry knew he should never watch the audience come in. Their intoxicated antics might stoke his hatred for them and only make his job that much more difficult. My God, Hap said, was I that bad when I was drinking? Harry was indeed a bad drunk, maybe not the worst on the circuit, but he had imploded on enough stages around the country to quash his hopes for a big-time career. Condemned with exile to the small time, Hap had decided to put down the booze once and for all. It takes what it takes, he sighed as he exhaled a cloud of cigarette smoke. Anyway, you can see I wasn't in such a great mood when I wrote that.
Yeah, that was a great, yeah. I think it really captures the mood, and with all the sort of intense detail, things like that.
Well, that's actually like a cautionary tale of kind of a double meaning. Just Put That Anywhere, because it's a comic who's an alcoholic comic who has his what they call his moment of clarity. And Just Put That Anywhere is also a stock line that you use when there's an offstage noise.
Okay.
And Just Put That Anywhere refers to what does he do with that moment of clarity.
So is he like a compilation of many characters you've known over the years?
Yeah, he's pretty close to me, actually, when I first started drinking.
Oh, yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
As you talk about being an angry guy in the angry art. So,
yeah. Thank you very much, George. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. Thanks.